The curious alien girl. The human research station hummed quietly on the surface of Talon 5, a planet known for its vibrant blue skies and swirling green oceans. Among the bustling crew of scientists and explorers was Dr. Ethan Carter, a biologist who had spent years studying alien species. Today, however, he wasn't focused on his experiments. Instead, he was being followed by a curious observer, Zara, a young Xaloran girl. Zara was not like other Xalorans. While her species generally avoided interacting with humans, preferring to stick to their highly logical and efficient ways, Zara had always been fascinated by the strangers from Earth. Her large golden eyes often watched the humans intently as they worked, laughed, and occasionally argued. Their behavior was so different from her own people, who communicated mostly through calm, emotionless gestures. One day, Zara stood in the corner of the station's common area, watching the human couple. The man cradled a tiny baby, gently rocking it in his arms, while the woman smiled warmly. Zara tilted her head, her expression full of curiosity. The baby made a small cooing sound, and the couple's faces lit up with joy. Zara had seen nothing like this before. "Dr. Carter," she called out, her melodic voice carrying across the room. Ethan looked up from his datapad. He had grown accustomed to Zara's endless questions. "Yes, Zara." Zara pointed at the couple. "What are they doing? And why does that small human look so different from the others?" Ethan hesitated, unsure how to answer. "That's their baby. Humans reproduce, and when they do, their offspring start out very small and grow over time." "Reproduce," Zara echoed, her eyes widening. "How does that work? And why do they seem so happy about it?" Ethan scratched the back of his head. Explaining human reproduction to an alien felt like walking into a minefield. He decided to keep it simple. "It's complicated, but it's how we continue our species. The happiness comes from the emotional bond humans feel with their children." Zora blinked, clearly unimpressed with his vague answer. "Emotional bond? My people don't do that. We use cloning chambers. It's efficient and doesn't require all this emotion." She waved her hand toward the couple, as if the very concept of emotion was baffling. "Well," Ethan said, chuckling nervously, "humans are a bit different. For us, emotions are important. They help us form connections with one another." Zora folded her arms, clearly not satisfied. "But why? It seems inefficient. Why waste time with feelings when you can just grow new humans in a controlled environment?" Ethan sighed. He should have known Zora wouldn't let this go. She was relentless when something piqued her interest. It's not something you can fully understand by watching. It's a part of being human. "Then teach me," Zora said, stepping closer. Her golden eyes gleamed with determination. "I want to understand why humans do this, why they value emotions so much." Ethan looked at her, unsure how to respond. He had come to respect Zora's sharp mind and boundless curiosity, but this was a topic he hadn't prepared to explain. Still, he could see she wouldn't take no for an answer. "All right," he said at last. "I'll try to explain, but it might take some time." Zora's face lit up with excitement, a rare display of emotion for Xaloran. "Good. I will prepare my questions." Ethan groaned internally, knowing he had just opened a very complicated door. As Zara walked away, already forming a mental list of things to ask, he couldn't help but wonder how this conversation would unfold. In the corner of the room, the human couple continued to coo over their baby, completely unaware that they had sparked an interspecies debate about the meaning of reproduction and emotions, a lesson in biology. The next morning, Zara appeared in Dr. Ethan Carter's lab, standing silently by the doorway as he calibrated a piece of equipment. Ethan pretended not to notice her at first, hoping she might lose interest, but after several long minutes of her unblinking stare, he sighed and set his tools down. "All right, Zara. Let's get this over with," he said, motioning her inside. Zara stepped forward, gliding over to the center of the room with the graceful movements common to her species. "I brought questions," she announced, pulling out a thin holographic slate filled with neatly organized notes. Ethan arched an eyebrow. Of course you did. She lifted the slate. First question. What is the biological mechanism that leads to human reproduction? Ethan nearly choked on his coffee. He coughed for several seconds while Zara watched, her head tilted slightly in confusion. I'm fine, he said quickly, waving his hand. That's a complicated place to start. I have many more, she added, flicking through her notes. Would you like to hear them all first, or one at a time? One at a time, Ethan said, holding up his hand. Let's start simple. He walked over to a terminal and pulled up a basic human anatomy chart on the display. Okay, this is a human body. You already know that much. Yes, Zara nodded. Humans have symmetrical forms, two of most things, except the heart and brain. Right. And reproduction. Well, it requires the cooperation of two humans, typically a male and a female. Zara squinted at the diagram. Cooperation. She seemed to chew on the word as if it didn't quite make sense. What exactly does this cooperation involve? Ethan hesitated. It's a process that involves genetic material from both individuals. Zara's golden eyes narrowed as she analyzed the diagram. Why not just use one person's genetic material? Would that not save time? Ethan chuckled. Well, if we did that, the offspring wouldn't have the genetic diversity that two parents provide. Diversity helps our species adapt and survive. Zara considered this. So, humans rely on randomness to strengthen their offspring. Interesting. She paused, tapping her chin thoughtfully. But this still doesn't explain the emotional connection. Why do they appear so attached to their offspring? Ethan smiled, leaning against the desk. Because raising a child is hard. It takes years, sometimes decades. Without that emotional bond, humans might not have the patience to care for them. Zara stared at him as if he had just spoken in riddles. Zalaran offspring are grown in incubation pods and fully mature in 5 years. There is no need for attachment. If something is difficult, we find ways to make it easier. Ethan shrugged. Humans take a different approach. The emotional bond isn't just a survival tactic. It's part of who we are. It makes us stronger as a species. Zara's gaze flicked back to the diagram. She seemed unconvinced. Perhaps emotions slow you down. My people believe efficiency is the key to progress. Ethan smirked. Efficiency can't replace connection. Trust me, if you had children, you'd feel the same way. I doubt that, Zara replied flatly. But I would like to see more evidence. Can we conduct an experiment? Ethan blinked. An experiment? On what exactly? On human emotions, Zara said matter-of-factly. I want to test this bond you speak of. I propose we simulate the conditions in which human offspring are raised and observe the results. Ethan stared at her, torn between disbelief and intrigue. You want to simulate raising a child? Yes. I can create a controlled environment to test the hypothesis, Zara said with a hint of excitement. I believe this will prove that emotions are not necessary for reproduction or growth. Ethan rubbed his forehead. Zara, I don't think you can simulate the experience of parenting. It's not something you can measure in a lab. Why not? She asked, folding her arms. If humans can reproduce, surely it can be studied like any other biological process. Ethan sighed but found himself intrigued by her determination. All right, fine. I'll humor you, but don't say I didn't warn you. Zara's eyes brightened at his agreement. Excellent. I will begin construction on the simulation chamber immediately. As she left the lab, Ethan leaned back in his chair, already questioning his decision. Zara's unrelenting curiosity might drive him to the brink, but at least it wouldn't be boring. Little did he know, Zara's experiment would lead to results neither of them expected. A cultural clash. The simulation chamber hummed softly as Zara finalized the last adjustments to the environment. It was a sleek, circular room filled with holographic projectors and adaptive technology designed to replicate various human experiences. Ethan stood at the entrance, arms crossed, watching with a mix of curiosity and dread. "You're really taking this seriously," Ethan said, stepping inside. The floor shifted beneath his feet, morphing into the appearance of a small human living room, complete with a couch, soft lighting, and even framed pictures of people who didn't exist. "Of course," Zora replied, tapping a holographic interface. "If I am to understand human reproduction and emotional bonding, I must simulate the conditions accurately. I have studied human environments extensively." Ethan glanced at the holographic picture of a smiling family on the wall. "Yeah, it's a little too perfect. No kids' drawings taped to the fridge or shoes scattered by the door." Zora blinked. "Is clutter necessary for emotional bonding?" "Sometimes," Ethan said with a smirk. Zora made a mental note and continued. "I have programmed a virtual offspring for this simulation. It will be biologically human but powered by artificial intelligence. I believe this will be sufficient to replicate the experience." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "Wait, you made a kid?" "Yes," Zora replied matter-of-factly. "Would you like to see her?" Before Ethan could respond, a small figure emerged from one of the side rooms. The child appeared to be about 6 years old, with dark hair and bright green eyes. She wore a simple blue dress and looked up at Ethan with an innocent, curious expression. "Hello," the child said with a cheerful smile. Ethan froze. "Okay, that's unsettling. She looks real." "That is the intention," Zora said proudly. "Her name is Ilara. She is programmed to respond to external stimuli and learn from her experiences, just as a human child would." Ilara stepped closer to Ethan, tilting her head. "Are you my father?" Ethan's eyes widened. "Oh boy, this is already weird." "I have designated you as the primary caregiver," Zora explained. "In order to fully understand the emotional bond you described, you will serve as the parental figure." Ethan rubbed his temples. "I'm not ready for this. I didn't sign up for virtual fatherhood." "You agreed to participate," Zora said, folding her arms. "It is important for the experiment." Ethan sighed, kneeling to meet Ilara's gaze. "All right, kid. Let's give this a shot." Ilara smiled and hugged Ethan without warning. He stiffened, unsure how to react. Zara observed the interaction with keen interest, recording data on her slate. "Is physical contact necessary for bonding?" Zara asked. Ethan gently patted Ilara on the back. "It helps. Kids need affection." Zora frowned. "Affection is inefficient." "Yeah, but it works," Ethan replied. "Humans thrive on connection. You'll see." Over the next several days, Ethan found himself increasingly involved in the simulation. Ilara's program was more advanced than he had expected. She laughed, cried, and even threw small tantrums when things didn't go her way. Zara, always nearby, documented everything with the meticulousness of a scientist studying a rare specimen. One evening, Ethan sat with Ilara on the couch, reading her a story from the station's database. She rested her head on his arm, listening intently. Zara watched from across the room, her expression unreadable. "I still fail to see the benefit of this," Zara remarked. "You are expending considerable energy and time on something that is not real." Ethan closed the book and glanced at her. "Maybe, but look at her. Even if she's not real, it feels real. And that connection, that's what makes humans who we are." Zora's eyes lingered on Ilara, who had fallen asleep against Ethan's side. For the first time, Zora felt a strange sensation, something close to admiration, though she would never admit it. "Perhaps there is value in this, inefficiency," Zora said quietly. Ethan smiled. "Told you. You can't measure everything in numbers, Zora. Sometimes, you just have to feel it." As the simulation continued, Zora couldn't shake the feeling that, despite the artificial setting, something had shifted within her. The experiment wasn't just about understanding humans anymore. It was about understanding herself. The experiment begins. Zora's simulation had evolved far beyond its initial parameters. What started as a sterile scientific exercise had transformed into something Ethan wasn't entirely comfortable with, but he couldn't deny he was intrigued. Ilara, the virtual child, had become an ever-present part of his daily routine. Ethan found himself tucking her in at night, answering endless questions about human life, and even teaching her basic tasks like brushing her hair or tying her shoes. Zara watched every interaction carefully, meticulously recording data, but there was something else, something unspoken, in her golden eyes whenever she observed Ethan and Ilara together. One evening, Zara summoned Ethan to the simulation chamber for what she called the next phase of the experiment. Ethan leaned against the doorway with his arms crossed. I thought raising a virtual kid was already pretty advanced. What's next? A virtual teenager. Zara didn't smile. Her expression remained clinical. Emotional bonds are not truly tested under ideal conditions, she said, bringing up a complex set of holographic data. I have programmed stress factors into the simulation. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Stress factors? What kind of stress are we talking about? Zara glanced briefly at him, then back to the screen. Minor challenges at first. Artificial scenarios that reflect what human parents might experience. Illness, fear, failure. I need to see how emotional bonds withstand adversity. Ethan frowned. So you're going to make Ilara suffer? She cannot suffer. She is not real, Zara replied bluntly. Ethan's jaw tightened. She feels real. Zara paused, her gaze flickering toward him. For the first time, she hesitated. I will ensure the scenarios are controlled. Ethan sighed, rubbing his forehead. All right. Just take it easy, Zara. The next day, the simulation began. Ilara greeted Ethan in the living room, her small form curled up on the couch with a book in her hands. Good morning, she said cheerfully. Ethan smiled, ruffling her hair. Morning, kiddo. You sleep well? She nodded. I dreamed about flying ships. As Ethan sat beside her, Zara's voice echoed softly over the simulation's internal speaker. Activating first scenario. Ethan shot a glance toward the nearest camera. Don't sound so ominous about it. The lights in the simulated living room dimmed slightly. Outside the windows, clouds gathered, and soft raindrops pattered against the glass. Ilara glanced up. It's raining, she said softly, a trace of nervousness in her voice. Ethan noticed immediately. You okay? It's just rain. She nodded slowly, but he could see the tension in her small shoulders. Zara's voice chimed in his ear. This is a test of the fear response. Many human children develop irrational fears. Let's observe her reaction. Ethan sighed. Hey, Ilara. Come here. She hesitated, but Ethan gently pulled her onto his lap. Rain can't hurt you. It's just water falling from the sky. Ilara nestled against him, nodding quietly. It feels strange. I don't like the sound. Ethan hugged her a little tighter. I've got you. Nothing to worry about. Zara watched from the control room, her eyes narrowing. Ilara's response wasn't perfectly aligned with her predictions. The AI's emotional modeling was evolving faster than she expected. Later that evening, Ethan tucked Ilara into bed. She clung to his arm for a moment longer than usual. You won't leave, right? I'll be here, Ethan said softly. As he left the room, Zara approached him just outside the simulated bedroom. You comforted her, Zara noted. Ethan gave her a look. That's what parents do. Zara stared through the glass window at the sleeping child. She is not real, she repeated, though her voice lacked its usual certainty. Ethan crossed his arms. Maybe not, but you can't tell me she doesn't feel real to you too. Zara didn't respond immediately. Her gaze lingered on Ilara for a long time. Finally, she turned to Ethan. I wish to understand this feeling, she admitted quietly. But I do not know how. Ethan's expression softened. You're already on the right path, Zara. You just need to let it happen. For the first time since the experiment began, Zara felt something stir within her. A strange warmth she couldn't fully explain. A surprising connection. The simulation had been running for weeks now, and Ethan could no longer deny that the lines between reality and fiction were blurring. What had started as a scientific exercise for Zara had turned into something far more personal. Ilara wasn't just a program anymore. At least, not to Ethan. He found himself thinking about her even when he wasn't inside the simulation chamber. Sometimes, as he walked the station corridors, he'd catch himself wondering if she had eaten breakfast or if she'd want to read another bedtime story. But Ilara wasn't real. That was the one fact Ethan couldn't forget, no matter how much it felt otherwise. Zara, however, still viewed the entire scenario as data collection, or at least Ethan thought she did. Late one evening, Ethan entered the simulation chamber to check in. Zara had been unusually quiet about the experiment all day, and he wondered if she'd grown bored of it. As the holographic environment booted up, he found Ilara sitting alone in the middle of the simulated living room, quietly playing with a small toy. "Hey, Ilara," Ethan said, stepping inside. She looked up immediately, her face lighting up. "Ethan, you're back." She ran to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. Ethan knelt down, smoothing her hair. "Of course, I'm back. I always come back." She pulled away slightly, her expression thoughtful. "Zara said I might have to be alone sometimes." Ethan frowned. "She told you that?" Ilara nodded. "She said it's part of the experiment." Ethan sighed. He could feel Zara's eyes on him through the cameras. Turning slightly, he glanced toward one of the observation lenses. "Zara, you and I need to talk." Moments later, Zara entered the room, her expression calm and unreadable as usual. She stood beside Ilara, studying her quietly for a few moments before turning to Ethan. "I have begun introducing isolation as part of the next phase," Zara explained. "Many human children experience moments without their parents. I believe it is necessary to observe how Ilara responds." Ethan shook his head. "Zara, she's not a test subject. You're treating her like an experiment. But she's more than that now. Can't you see it?" Zara's gaze flicked to Ilara, who had resumed playing but kept stealing nervous glances at the two adults. "She is not real," Zara said again, but her voice lacked conviction. Ethan knelt next to Ilara and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Tell me something, Zara. If she's not real, why does she look at you like that?" Zara hesitated. Ilara's eyes lingered on her, filled with a quiet longing. One that mirrored the way human children often looked at their parents, seeking approval and comfort. "She's adapting to you," Ethan continued. "Not just me. She watches you. She listens to you. You might not want to admit it, but you're part of this too." Zara remained silent, her arms folded tightly across her chest. For Exalaran, admitting uncertainty was rare. Finally, Zara spoke, her voice softer than usual. "I did not expect this." She was meant to reflect basic human behaviors, not this level of attachment. Ethan stood, glancing down at Ilara, as she hummed softly to herself, completely absorbed in her play. "Maybe that's the point. Maybe you're seeing something your people never considered. Connection isn't something you program or control. It happens naturally." Zara stepped closer to Ilara. Kneeling beside her, the child looked up, smiling brightly at her. "Do you think I did well today, Zara?" Ilara asked innocently. Zara's eyes flickered with something Ethan hadn't seen before, hesitation mixed with tenderness. She nodded. "Yes, Ilara, you did well." Ilara beamed at the praise and returned to her toy, satisfied. Ethan watched Zara carefully, noting the subtle shift in her demeanor. "You're starting to understand it, aren't you?" Zara didn't respond, but the soft way she gazed at Ilara spoke volumes. For the first time, Ethan realized the experiment wasn't just about Ilara learning to understand emotions. It was about Zara discovering something her species had long dismissed. And perhaps, just perhaps, this simulation had already become far more real than either of them had anticipated. The realization. Ethan sat in the simulated living room, his gaze drifting to Ilara as she lay on the couch, curled under a blanket. Her breathing was slow and rhythmic, but her small hand occasionally twitched, signs that even in sleep, her mind remained active. Zara stood silently across the room, observing from a distance. The faint blue light from the simulation's interface cast a soft glow on her pale features. Her golden eyes, usually cold and analytical, now seemed conflicted. "You're spending more time in here," Ethan said quietly, breaking the silence. Zara didn't respond immediately. Her eyes lingered on Ilara, as if searching for something in the child's sleeping form. Finally, she said, "It is necessary for the data." Ethan smirked but didn't push. "Sure, for the data." They sat in silence for a few minutes, the faint hum of the simulation filling the room. Ethan found his gaze shifting between Zara and Ilara, noticing how Zara's once detached presence had softened. The way she watched Ilara now wasn't the way a scientist observed a subject. It was how someone looked at family. "You've grown attached," Ethan said finally. Zara's head snapped toward him. "That is inaccurate. Attachment implies irrational bias." Ethan chuckled softly. "Right. And yet, you're here every night." Zara's posture stiffened. "She is evolving beyond her parameters. I must ensure there are no irregularities." Ethan leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "You can keep telling yourself that, but I know what I see. It's not irregularity, Zara. It's connection. She looks up to you." Zara's gaze dropped slightly, a rare flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. "Valorans do not form emotional bonds in the same way humans do. We reproduce through cloning, and offspring are raised by collective educators, not individual parents." Ethan nodded. "I know. But you're not just any Xaloran. You're here, on a human station, simulating what it's like to raise a child. Maybe you're starting to see things differently." Zara hesitated, as if carefully choosing her next words. "There are moments," she admitted softly, "when I feel something. When she looks at me and asks questions, or when she smiles after receiving praise." Ethan smiled gently. "That's called being a parent, Zara. It's messy and confusing, but it's also one of the best things humans experience. Maybe it's not just a human thing after all." Zara took a step closer to Ilara, kneeling by the couch. She reached out tentatively, brushing a strand of hair from the child's face. Ilara stirred slightly but didn't wake. "It is strange," Zara murmured. "This feeling. It is unfamiliar." Ethan's voice softened. "That's how it starts. One day, you're explaining basic biology. The next, you're worrying if they're warm enough at night or if they had a bad dream. It's not efficient, but it's what makes us, us." Zara's hand lingered near Ilara's hair for a moment longer before she stood, folding her arms tightly. This was not the intended outcome of the experiment. "No," Ethan agreed, "but maybe it's the outcome you needed." Zara turned to him, and for the first time since the simulation began, her expression was vulnerable. "I do not know what to do with these feelings." Ethan smiled. "You don't have to do anything. Just let them happen." They stood quietly for a while, both watching over Ilara as she slept. Then Zara spoke again, her voice softer than before. "If I were human, do you believe I could be a good parent?" Ethan glanced at her, surprised by the question. "Zara, you already are." A faint smile touched Zora's lips, and she nodded. As they left the simulation room together, Ethan knew the experiment had already succeeded, but not in the way Zora had planned. The real success wasn't in understanding how humans bonded with their children. It was in proving that even across species, the capacity for love, connection, and growth could transcend logic and biology. And as Zara walked beside him, glancing one last time at Ilara through the closing door, Ethan was certain of one thing. Zara wasn't just learning about humanity. She was becoming part of it. A new perspective. The simulation had ended, but its effects lingered long after the holographic chamber shut down. The quiet hum of the equipment faded into silence, yet Ethan felt like the room still held echoes of Ilara's laughter and Zara's hesitant but genuine attempts to bond with her. Zara stood next to him, arms folded, staring at the now dormant chamber. Her expression was neutral, but Ethan could see the subtle tension in her shoulders, the kind of weight that wasn't there before the experiment began. "It feels empty," Zara said quietly. Ethan nodded, leaning against the doorway. "Yeah, funny how that happens, isn't it?" Zara's golden eyes met his. "Is this what human parents feel when their offspring leave?" "Pretty much," Ethan replied. "They call it empty nest syndrome. You spend years raising someone, teaching them, and suddenly they're gone. Even if it's just a simulation, it feels real." Zara glanced back at the chamber, her gaze softening. "I did not expect this outcome." Ethan smirked. "You say that a lot lately." Zara let out a small breath, something between a sigh and an exhale of thought. "I have reviewed the data. The experiment succeeded in demonstrating the emotional complexity of human bonding. But," she paused, clearly wrestling with her words, "I do not know if I wish to terminate the program entirely." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You mean Ilara?" Zara hesitated, then nodded. Ethan smiled knowingly. "You've grown attached. It's not just data anymore, is it?" Zara's gaze lowered, almost as if she was ashamed to admit it. "Xalarans are not meant to form such attachments. Our society views it as inefficient." "Well, sometimes inefficiency is the best part of life," Ethan said. "Love isn't efficient. Neither is raising kids, but that's what makes it worthwhile." Zara remained silent, but Ethan could see the internal struggle reflected in her eyes. Finally, she broke the quiet. "I have submitted a request to extend the simulation. Unofficially." Ethan's eyes widened slightly. "You did?" Zara nodded. "Ilara's program will continue to evolve. I have calibrated her systems to adapt outside of the simulation chamber. She will reside in the station's learning quarters under limited observation." Ethan couldn't hide his smile. "You're keeping her?" "I am not keeping her," Zara corrected, though the defensive edge in her voice had softened. "I am continuing the experiment for further analysis." Ethan chuckled. "Right. Analysis. Of course." Zara's gaze narrowed slightly, though there was no real irritation behind it. "Your sarcasm is noted, Ethan." He raised his hands in surrender. "I'm just saying, this is more than science now. Whether you want to admit it or not, Ilara became something more to you." Zara's eyes drifted toward the chamber once more. "Perhaps," she admitted softly. A silence settled between them, but it was no longer uncomfortable. "I suppose this is what it means to evolve," Zara said at last. "Not through biology, but through experience." Ethan smiled, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're getting it. That's the human way." For a long time, Zara didn't move. Then she slowly placed her own hand over Ethan's, as if mimicking the gesture she had observed so many times between him and Ilara. It wasn't a perfect replication of human emotion, but it was close enough. As they left the chamber and walked through the corridors of the station, Zara glanced at Ethan. "Do you believe humans and Xalarans are truly so different?" Ethan shook his head. "Not as much as you think. We're just two sides of the same coin. You're learning that now." Zara's eyes gleamed softly under the artificial lights. "Perhaps humanity is more contagious than I anticipated." Ethan grinned. "That's the thing about being human. Once you start down the path, it's hard to turn back." And as they continued down the hall, Zara allowed herself the smallest of smiles. One she didn't try to suppress this time. For the first time in her life, inefficiency didn't seem like such a terrible thing after all.